Another day, another waterfall. Let's go see what we can find here beneath the beautiful mountains. Beautiful cascades running through the foreground here. The fall, look at that tree. So there's quite a few elements that we can work with. Absolutely beautiful. It's all in the little details. Got to make sure that tree is not cutting into the waterfall, so getting a bit lower from this perspective. Now the tree goes above the waterfall. Always good to experiment with your shutter speeds. I'm sitting around 1/3 of a second, 0.4, and just looking at the different textures we get. Particularly, not so much on the waterfall, it's all about the cascades and the lines that you can create. Just utilising this log now in the foreground. Some nice greens on there. It's nice to get those leaves in the foreground with the moss. A little bit tricky if the shutter speed's just trying to time it in between wind gusts. We're just looking underneath the log now, and there's a nice natural frame here with those greens. The challenge is the wind, so we're bracketing. Faster exposure is going to freeze all the greens, and then we get the slower exposure for the water. Basically, we like water slow and we like the leaves fast. I'll give you a rough idea somewhere in here, and then with the bracket, 3 exposures. 1, 2, 3. Always pays to check out all your compositional options. Bit too simple here for me, I think. Alright, it's been a fun shoot. There's a cloud up there which is bouncing the light down onto the foreground cascades, and they're getting a little bit distracting now. So it's a nice time to just stop shooting, enjoy the moment, and then walk out of here. Alright, here we are in ACR. Let me show you a quick rundown on the processing and blending the images together. You see here I have the 3 exposures, and what we have, I don't have the exposure bracket now. I've got a focus stack instead. So out in the field, I realized that it was getting calm enough to capture these leaves in between those gusts of wind. So I didn't really need the fast shutter speed, but because I was so close to the foreground here, you see at f11, this background is just out of focus. And then when I focus on the background, which is sharp here, obviously the log is out of focus. So I couldn't get the depth of field, I had to focus stack. So this is what we do in that scenario. This first frame here is nice and in focus on the foreground, with the exception of 1 or 2 leaves which are blowing. We'll talk about that in a minute, but otherwise look, we're nice and sharp in the front. And then the third frame is really the other one we want for the background. So I don't really need that middle frame anyway. But what I do in this scenario, I need to apply an edit across all 3 images. So I can just hold down Command and push A. They're all active now. And for something like this here, quick rundown on the processing, I'd apply a landscape profile. Okay, that's just adjusted the colors slightly and the dynamic range. And then I'm going to brighten up the exposure just so I can see some of the details here. I don't want to go too bright though. It's going to remove the sense of depth, especially if this foreground gets too bright. So I'm going to leave that there. And then we'll remove some of the highlights. That's one thing I'll often do in these forest scenes, just to get rid of that contrast and any glare or distractions. So I'm going to pull that down to about -45. Now I want to see some of the darker details though, subtly. So let's say about 20 on the shadow recovery. The color side of things, I'm going to open this up and looking at the image, it's quite blue. I might just warm that up slightly. I don't mind the cooler look, but I think just bringing it up a little bit, somewhere around there. And often I'll find the magenta's too high, it's just the auto white balance and my camera for these forest scenes. In this case, I will bring that more into the greens. Personal preference, but somewhere about there. Doesn't need much vibrance or saturation. We'll give it a touch of vibrance, like so. There's a few highlights creeping in the top of the frame, which I like. I'm going to warm those up, so I'll open the color grading, select a warm hue somewhere up in here, hold shift and click and drag, and you'll see it's just warming that upper canopy. It's quite subtle, nothing major. Now, a few local adjustments are absolutely necessary to bring out the details and that three-dimensionality. So what I'll do is I push K for an adjustment brush. If you haven't seen me process before, just check out some other videos where I might break it down a bit slower than this one. But in this case, we're just going to lift up some shadows and blacks for the distance and just start to press this area off away, okay? Pushing it back, and we're pushing it back because it's has lighter values, less tonal range, so it naturally looks further away than some of the subject matter in the front, which is more of a high contrast, okay? So probably somewhere around there with those shadows and blacks. I'm going to push K again. This time I'm actually going to slightly reduce the highlights further and just run that along the foreground log on this lower edge of it, because I don't want that to steal the show. So I'm just kind of dulling that down. I'm going to push K a third time. And this time we're going to lift the whites, and this will allow me to just bring out anything that has a hint of light on it. So watch this, ready? If I pull this up, and that's going to work wonders on our moss. We'll do some highlights as well, but it's leaving the darker values as they are, and therefore only lifting anything that naturally has a touch of light. So some of these greens, think of it as dodging, basically. So just lifting anything with a bit of light. I like the water down there. I'm going to push K one last time for the water. Shadows, whites, blacks, just anything to bring out that beautiful green, that emerald green, my favorite color down there. You don't want to go too far, something like that. Before, after. And if you wanted to, you could probably just diffuse that light creeping in the top of the frame. I've got an exposure up and a bit of rehazing just up here. Again, it just decreases the tonal range up there, but especially the rehaze. It's lifting the mid-tone values, making it lighter, therefore making it look further away. All right, let's leave that there. So that's your basic edit. What about the focus stacking? What do we do? Well, we only really need the two frames, the foreground one here, and then our background frame. So I'm going to click the first one, hold Command, and select the second frame. And then over to the right-hand corner, I'm going to push Open. Here I am in the main body of Photoshop, and I have my two files, one up the top here, 65, and then 67. We're going to click on 65, and there's so many ways you can put a focus stack together, but basically we need these as layers, one on top of the other. If you're leaving Lightroom, you can just open as layers. You just can't do that from ACR, which is where I was. So I'm going to copy paste. I'm going to hit this one, the foreground one, and do Command A to select all, Command C to copy. Then I hit 67, click on 67, then I do Command V to paste. So I just basically did copy 65 and paste it onto 67. You will see down the bottom here we have the two layers. So 0 is the foreground, layer 1 is the background. To do the focus stack, so at the moment we're only viewing layer 1 because it's the top layer. So if I zoom in, you'll see we are sharp. Layer 1 is the foreground. So you see the leaves are sharp in the front here, along the edge, slightly out of focus in the background. If we turn layer 1 off, bang, sharp in the background. So what do? We'll try the automated method. I need both layers selected. I hold Shift and click the bottom one. They're both gray, and now it's Edit, Auto Align Layers, and just leave that on auto. So it's just going to align them. And remember, this was handheld at 0.2 seconds as well. And people always ask about that. How do you do it? Well, you saw how I did it. Nice and steady, camera with stabilization, and lots of practice, I guess, over the years. So we've auto aligned and now auto blend. We're going to blend these, and we want to stack images. Now, yes, if you're on a tripod, the workflow is exactly the same. You still need to auto align. Getting a tripod of this composition would have been tricky though. So it's quite high, head high, leaning right in towards that log. All right, so it's done the blending. Now the checking part. You zoom in and just make sure that there's no errors running along, checking your leaves all the way through. Now check the corners. Now there's something that's jumped out at me, and this will happen a lot on these waterfall frames when you do a focus stack, but if you have a look in here, look at this patchy masking that's happened. So in this scenario, click B for brush. Make sure you're on the layer. This top layer, I think, is the one we're going to need. I've got a white brush, and I'm basically going to mask that back to the other layer. So instead of using whatever waterfall it's blended in here, whatever frame, I'm saying no, use the other one, not the one that you're currently using. And that way we're just getting a cleaner result and none of that pixelation. And that would often happen, like I said, on this slow moving water. It's just the software can't really recognize what's going on there. There's one other pretty nasty part too. Run that in like so. Hit that rock a little bit. Now, the big question and point I probably want to bring up, the leaf in the foreground down here. This is where I could go back through my raw files and find one that was sharp and just blend that in manually, masking it. Or, to be honest, I'm just going to leave it. I feel like years ago I would have done that. I would have blended one in. It's such a minor detail that I just don't really think it's going to matter. Maybe if I was printing this large, going above 30 inches or more, especially for a customer, a client, okay, yes, I'll probably go in and patch that up. But for now, it's fine. I just don't think it's worth all the time and effort on this minor detail. It's just what it is, okay? So I guess what I'm saying is don't spend a lot of time trying to make everything absolutely perfect. There's no such thing as perfect, and perhaps in your frame, you're concentrating on a detail like that, not realizing that there's some other big issues going on with your comp or your subject matter anyway, for example, okay? So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to now Command-Alt-Shift-E, and it just gives me a new layer built off everything below. I need to get rid of that edging. So I can do Command-T and just scale this out. If I hold Shift and drag, you can just do one individual side at a time as well. I don't mind a small amount of light being up here, the sky, but I wouldn't have too much. It's a shame I've lost that upper branch of the tree, but compositionally that was quite high in the frame anyway. At least if I have that lower branch, that's the main thing that I'm hoping for. That's a pretty big subject matter there, and it somewhat counterbalances out all the leaves on the lower left. Fall slightly in the middle. It's flowing the eye back to the center. And I love this big rock here. Again, that counterbalances the greens on this side. So lots of balance going on in the frame, and positioning myself so we could have that clear pathway of light, water running through like so. So that's where my head was at anyway, putting this composition together. The center of the image is approximately, say, here. So where did I put the waterfall? Slightly left of center, because where does the waterfall then end up? Back in the center. So if I put the waterfall dead center, then it would run the eye over there. So I've positioned it so it flows us through. We've got a nice clean flow, big shape coming across, big shapes down here. So there's a nice natural balance, at least in my mind anyway. Even this tree here comes into the frame quite well. Processing wise, that's pretty close to how I would more or less leave this one. I did do a whole edit of this prior to filming this video, but the final result's very similar. Sometimes I'd use the dodge tool as well, leave it on midtones and just tap away and just hit some of that moss, and that can help lift out some of those greens. But anything now is just going to be very minor adjustments, the bulk of the work has been done, and that's how you put your focus stack together. Hope that was helpful and you might have picked up a few tips there. Please leave any questions or comments below. Thank you for your support, and hopefully I'll see you in a new video shortly.